Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a real head-scratcher that mixes love, a ton of money, and some really tricky law. It's a story about what happens when the official paperwork for a house says one thing, but the reality of a marriage says something completely different.
So, here's the central question. A husband, Robert, is the sole earner and pays for everything. His wife, Rayala, ends up with 99% of the house on paper. So, who does it really belong to? At first glance, you might think you have the answer, but believe me, in the eyes of the law, it is anything but simple.
All right, so first, let's just lay out all the puzzle pieces. You really need to see the numbers to understand how a court would even begin to figure this out.
Okay, so check this out. Robert drops $500,000 of his own cash for the deposit. Then they get a massive $1.5 million loan together in both their names. But, and here's the kicker, the legal title gets split 99% to Rayla and just a tiny 1% to Robert. The reason they gave? Just an administrative thing for tax planning. Now you're going to want to remember that detail. It becomes super important later. So with such a bizarre 99-to-1 split on paper, where does the law even start to look for the truth? Well, the first thing it does is pretty logical. It ignores the title for a second and just follows the money. The law's first move is to use something called the presumed resulting trust. Now, I know that sounds super technical, but the idea behind it is actually really simple. It basically says the law assumes you intended to own a piece of the property that's equal to the amount of money you put in. It's the legal system's way of saying you get what you paid for. So if we look at how this property was paid for, it's pretty clear Robert paid that first 25%, the deposit. But what about the other 75%? You know, that giant $1.5 million loan that was in both their names? How does the law split that up? Well, the standard rule, the default way of looking at it, is really straightforward. If two people are on a loan, the law sees them as each being responsible for half. So, when you add Robert's $500,000 deposit to his half of the loan, his total financial contribution suddenly jumps to over 62% of the property's value. That is a long way from the 1% on the title.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The law doesn't always just stop at that default rule. There's a special rule that can come into play and completely flip the script on how that loan is viewed. And, well, it changes everything.
See, the law actually lets courts look behind the official documents. It lets them ask a very human question. Was there an understanding between them, even if it wasn't written down, about who was really going to pay that loan back? It's about the reality of their situation, not just the names on the paperwork. And when you apply this special rule to our puzzle, the picture becomes incredibly clear. Who was the only one earning money? Robert. Who had no income at all? Rayala. And who was actually making every single mortgage payment? Yep, Robert. A court would almost certainly look at this and say, come on, there was clearly an unspoken agreement here. Robert was going to cover the entire loan. And that special rule has a massive, massive impact. Because once you say Robert is responsible for that whole $1.5 million loan, on top of his deposit, his financial contribution becomes 100%, the entire thing. So you'd think, okay, case closed, right? The house is his. But not even close. Because the law has another powerful tool in its kit. And this one doesn't look at the money at all. It looks at the relationship itself. And this is the heart of Rayala's counterargument. It's called the presumption of advancement. Now, this is a very old legal principle. It was originally designed to protect wives back when they couldn't even own property. It basically says that when a husband puts property in his wife's name, the law doesn't assume he's expecting to get it back. It presumes he intended to give it to her as a gift to advance her financial standing. And this idea, this presumption, is especially strong in a case like this one. Why? Because Rayala was completely 100% financially dependent on Robert. It makes total sense that a court would assume that by putting 99% of a house in her name, Robert was trying to provide for her to make sure she was secure. And there's another piece of evidence that really backs up this gift idea. The property was actually called a family investment. Now think about that phrase for a second. That language flies directly in the face of a 100% claim by one person. A family investment just screams shared benefit, which really weakens the argument that Robert meant to keep it all for himself. Okay, but let's talk about the elephant in the room.
The whole reason for this weird 99-1 split was for tax planning. So, does that sketchy motive completely derail Robert's entire claim to the property?
You might be surprised, but the short answer is no. The law's a bit more nuanced than that. A court won't automatically disqualify someone just for having a questionable motive. It does a balancing act. And in this case, denying Robert any share of a house he paid for would be a wildly disproportionate penalty, especially for a tax scheme that they never even went through with. So that illegality defense, it fails. So after all that, where does it leave us? I mean, on one hand, we have the money trail, which points straight to Robert owning 100% of the house. But on the other hand, you have this really powerful presumption of a gift, which points to Riella owning 99%. How does a court possibly square that circle?
Well, they split it right down the middle. Faced with two powerful but totally opposite legal arguments, the most likely thing a judge would do is set them both aside, the weird 99-1 title and the 100% money trail, and just conclude that their true intention deep down was to own the property equally, 50-50.
And this framework really sums up the whole legal roller coaster we've been on. The court starts by following the money using that presumed resulting trust, or PRT, which points to a 100% share for Robert. But then that's pushed back against by the presumption of advancement, the POA, this idea of a gift within their marriage. And in the end, neither argument totally wins. Instead, the court just balances them both out to find a fair middle ground.
This whole case really leaves us with a huge, fundamental question. In situations like this, where personal relationships and financial deals are completely tangled up, what should the law prioritize? Should it follow the cold, hard numbers on a bank statement? Or should it try to understand the unwritten intentions and obligations that come with being a family? It's a puzzle with no easy answer.